to start just by telling you a short personal story, and that is that only a couple of years ago my grandfather died and he left various boxes. I wonder whether, is the lighting a bit bright here? Can you see that okay? You're okay? And he left various boxes and containers that hold the remnants of his life. They're hidden stories for the most part, letters written mostly in Russian, and objects, including tools. He was an electrical engineer in Russia before being caught up in the Second World War, watching his father executed, working in a German work camp in occupied Poland where my mother was born, and then finally coming to Adelaide in Australia. And his stories are hidden to me in the sense that, apart from the ones that he told me directly, some of which I've recorded on a voice recorder, most of them are written in Russian in the form of these letters between him and his brother, who stayed in the USSR, and they never saw each other again. But they're also hidden in the sense that my grandfather felt so lost and persecuted in Australia, even though his world had improved so much. He felt marginalised, lost, displaced, paranoid about being watched by spies. You know, it's a typical kind of story. But I think the documentation of his life in this very traditional form, which would be available to people like my mother who can read the language, is so different to the sort of digital documentation that we have today. The tradition of letter writing is being abandoned, and we're leaving traces of our lives in distributed spaces of the internet and on our personal computers. But it makes me think, well, where will the biographers of the future look for this information? And it's a simple point, but we all know the kind of mismanagement that comes with technology. So my interest is in traditional forms of biography, but also this pressing question of how we are archiving our lives, how we're expressing ourselves, how our identities are changing, and what that means for the study of the past. I'm a historian by my background, in the 18th century field actually, but then I moved into this digital field. So I want to briefly reflect on an emerging field which I'm calling digital biography, and it has no accepted boundaries. But what sort of pressures and changes does the digital environment bring for biography and the recording of lives? And what future is there for biography? These are the big questions that I'm trying to ask in the book project that I'm working on. The activities, formats and genres in this field are rarely associated with traditional biographical studies, but instead they're the domain of digital privacy, copyright, data preservation, identity management. The main interest is in legal studies, information management, multimedia design, IT development, these kinds of fields, as well as in sociology, psychology and marketing. But given that online identity has become such a significant focus of attention in so many fields, the time seems right that it's really grappled with in the biographical field. These digital incursions will transform our concepts of self and identity, truth and fiction, memory and imagination, reality and fabrication, the public and the private, and they're already doing that. We see it everywhere. In the biographical field, technology has played a part in this new interest in what's called life writing, the kind of the different sorts of documents that we now seek out to try and understand lives better. Biography has moved a long way from the stories of famous figures, and it's taking many different forms in the digital environment, but they're not necessarily called a biography right now. So the reason I've got this title here of distributed identity, distributed selves rather, is the sense that our identity is being scattered. And I think one of the defining features of the online environment is that people's lives in this online space are easily manipulated at any time. Bits and pieces of people's lives are scattered across different sorts of websites, whether it be social networking sites or simply your own personal spaces that you might use online, but they're multiple. In some of the papers today, there's a theme of the biological meeting the technological, well, of course, in all sorts of ways that runs through the day, but these cyborg fantasies are not so distant and perhaps not so frightening if you consider how much information is kept on a mobile phone these days. These devices are becoming extensions, prosthetic kind of extensions of our bodies, and so my interest is also in this kind of extension of our body into the hardware that we carry around with us. And I was reading recently about a project called the Companions Project at the University of Sheffield, which seems remarkable. 14 partners from Europe and the US, 13 million euro funding. It's an interdisciplinary program that is creating these persistent agents, they're called, personal companions that help develop a relationship with an owner. And they're designed as biography devices. This is how it's explained. I think this is quite incredible. Sensitive to, this is a quote, sensitive to the needs of and relationship with the single owner. The companion becomes, in a precise sense, part of the user's memory, essentially their memory of themselves and their life events. So this is impacting on the study of biography, but again, this kind of thing isn't really discussed within the biographical studies field. Through all this, the main concern is the potential impoverishment of biography. This Companions project is driven by the underlying assumption that a life narrative can be formed simply by accumulating and storing information, such as conversations, diary entries, photos, videos, maps, in a way that can be performed at command by this rudimentary digital accomplice. It doesn't take account of the complexity of the shaping process that's always gone into the writing a life. One thing you could say is that the biographical form is thriving in all of its traditional forms. In bookshops, there are whole sections devoted to biography in the way that there never used to be only a couple of decades ago. On television, there are whole stations devoted to biography. But there are very few examples of accepted digital genres for biography. But I'll show you a website, actually, a project that I've just been involved with, which is a collective memory kind of project based on my hometown of Fremantle in Western Australia. And we wanted to try and capture, a bit like a time capsule, the impressions of people in the community today. And we thought about it as a kind of collective biography, but really it's just a very small archive at this stage. Actually, as I was walking around Brighton yesterday, I thought how similar it was in many ways to the port town of Fremantle. If I was to choose somewhere to live here, I think I would come here because it was very familiar. So what we wanted to do was to create a community resource where we could learn about the stories that people had of the place and their reflections of its history over time and the changes that took